Some things you only believe because you live them. And this story, my friend, if I told it to you in a bar, you'd laugh and say it was an exaggeration. But I swear to all that is holy, every word here has been a chapter in a headache with a Mexican soap opera feel and an action movie soundtrack. It started on a lazy Sunday, the kind of day when you just want to sit in the backyard, listening to some music, drinking something cold, and pretending that life is good. My mother, a soft-spoken lady with a strong presence, was watering her plants, as she does every evening. She doesn't bother anyone. She doesn't shout. She doesn't invade space. She doesn't park in front of someone else's garage. But you know what bothers me more than noise? People who disturb the peace of others. She's here, the woman. She always shows up with that tight little stride, looking like she's about to deliver a subpoena. Social blouse, beige knee-length shorts, and that little smile of someone who has hated your existence before they even knew your name. And the worst thing is that she doesn't knock on your door. She invades the room as if she were visiting a theme park where everything is hers. "Are you going to water this mess one more time?" was the opening line. I swear to God I thought it was a joke, but she was serious, looking at my mother as if she were talking to a cleaner who had forgotten to clean the skirting board. My mother gave that little smile of someone who knows she's dealing with an idiot dressed as a person and continued watering the plants. The woman didn't like it. She raised her voice, made drama, said that the plants were ugly, that they were devaluing the facade of the neighborhood, that this type of vegetation was disorganized, without aesthetic planning. That's because there were 3 pots with jiboya and some succulents, one of them in the shape of a heart, which my mother got from my brother for Mother's Day. So far, so good. It was just another outbreak of someone who doesn't take their medication on time. But then came the moment when the mad woman decided to cross the line of sanity and fall into the abyss of stupidity, because that's when she spoke, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "I don't know how a good-for-nothing like you still lives here. It must be because they accept any kind of person in this neighborhood now." My mother's breathing failed for 2 seconds. I froze. The next-door neighbor, who was mowing his lawn, stopped the mower, and for a moment, time froze like a movie scene. It was so offensive, so unnecessary, that even the dog on the corner barked with indignation. But my mother, this woman, is made of a different material. Instead of fighting back, she wiped her hands on her flowered apron, looked deep into the creature's eyes, and said, in a low, surgical voice, "You only keep saying that because you still don't understand who you're messing with." There was no shouting, no fuss. There was a veiled threat that made the other stutter for a second and back off. But of course she laughed, rolled her eyes, and said the classic, "That's a lot of people." She turned her back and walked away like she'd won the Oscar for arrogance. But the problem is that my mother is not alone. My mother is respected. My mother is the kind of person who, when she goes into a market, the cashier stands up. When she goes to church, even the pastor asks how she's doing. And, most importantly, she's Tomas's mother. Ah, Tomas. You know that older brother you have who is always traveling for work, but never posts anything on social media? Who has a tattoo on the roof of his mouth and doesn't talk about what he does, only about family matters? That's right. Tomas is my older brother, and he heard everything. He was in the house, visiting my mother, sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee with cheese bread, laughing at memes on his cell phone. When he heard useless, it was as if someone had pulled the demon out of him. He got up without saying a word, walked past me with glazed eyes, calmly walked up the street and stopped right in front of his wife's house. He didn't ring the doorbell. He just took his cell phone out of his pocket, opened a group called "Family is Everything," typed in 3 words, and put the phone back in his pocket. I didn't even have to ask. I already knew. It was done. And as if it were part of a choreographed movie, the next day, the cars started arriving. One by one, black, with tinted windows, touched by drivers who didn't even look to the side, silent, without honking, in no hurry, as if they were going to a wake where the only thing missing is the coffin. And they arrived. 4, 10, 15, until, at the end of the afternoon, the whole street was filled. More than 30 cars. People leaning against the doors, arms crossed, black shirts on, looking like they were in no hurry, let alone afraid. Even the delivery boys turned away. The letter carrier, he didn't even show up. The gossipy neighbor who lives in the window, he closed the curtain and pretended he wasn't home. The wife? She disappeared. They say she was locked in the bathroom with her husband freaking out. Others swear she called her lawyer, asking if aesthetic intimidation is a reason to sue. I don't know. The only certainty was that she had messed with the wrong person, because, that day, the whole neighborhood understood that this was not the territory of those who are bossed around by the HOA. It was a land of respect, of history, of ties that extend beyond the surname and the facade of the house. On Monday, the neighborhood woke up differently. It looked like the street had aged 10 years overnight. The neighbors who used to walk by with their dogs on leashes now turned around at the gate. The woman who used to go for a walk in pink leggings and headphones now crossed the street as soon as she saw any of the guys leaning against their cars. The silence was thick, almost solid. And it wasn't just the silence of someone who's afraid to make noise. It was the kind of silence that tells you there's something big going on, and you just don't know how far it will go. The cars were still there. More than 30. The same ones. Standing still, spotless, as if they had been washed in vinegar of revenge. And the men didn't look like anyone else. They didn't look like they were delivering an app or meeting in a condominium. They had tattoos in places that not even God would think of touching. They had the kind of posture you don't learn in the gym. It's something you only develop when you've been forced to run with a body on your shoulders. They weren't playing around, and nobody doubted it. The woman, the same one who until the other day was handing out HOA pamphlets on people's doorsteps, demanding harmonious visual standards, now didn't even show up to pick up the mail. Her husband? He's gone. He disappeared like bad Wi-Fi. Some tongues said he took a hotel in the next town until things cooled down. What was really cold was the wife's blood, who, according to a friend of the doorman's sister-in-law, spent the whole day looking through the crack in the shutter, holding a rosary in one hand and pepper spray in the other. The irony of the situation was delicious. She wanted to maintain the aesthetic order of the neighborhood. The result? It looked like a 2000s rap video convention had been parked outside her house. People didn't dare complain. Nobody dared. Because who's going to pick a fight with 100 guys with chains around their necks, their faces closed, and their arms crossed? It was as if the neighborhood had been transported to a parallel reality, where condominium rules were worthless, and the only code was respect. My mother, she got on with her life. She planted, swept the yard, made corn cake, and brought coffee to the people in the cars. Yes, you read that right. She made coffee, and when she brought the tray with the cups, no one refused. There was no smile or forced kindness, but there was a nod, a dry thank you, and that said it all. My mother was never one for shouting, but everyone has learned that her silence carries a weight that doesn't need a megaphone. Around Wednesday, she decided to go to the bakery. She put on her usual flowery dress, the one that has seen more drama than many soap operas. She put on lipstick, grabbed her handbag, and went. And the detail? He walked in front of his wife's house, quietly, with her head held high and her step steady. It looked like a victory parade. The woman? She was at the window. You could see her wide eyes behind the cheap white lace curtain. One of the guys in the car stepped to the side and made room for my mother to pass. No one said anything. They didn't have to. That was the equivalent of lifting the trophy. On the way back, what was needed to turn the situation into a legend happened. A man who had lived there for years, one of those pensioners who only talks to the newspaper and his cat, stopped my mother on the sidewalk. He took off his hat, bowed his head, and said, "You deserve all this. It was the only time my mother had cried in public since my father's funeral. But she didn't cry out of sadness. She cried in the way that only those who are humiliated and then exalted understand. At the end of the week, the street became an attraction. People from other neighborhoods started taking a tour just to see if it was true. And it was. Totally true. The woman who once said my mother was a nuisance now had new security cameras, curtains that were always closed, and delivery left on the sidewalk. No one wanted to set foot in her garden anymore. Fear? Maybe? Guilt? I doubt it. But the presence of those dozens of cars, those figures standing like statues of respect and menace, wasn't just about my mother. It was a message to everyone. That street, that neighborhood, that piece of land had an owner. And it wasn't the people who signed the papers for the Residents Association. It was the person who made history there. They were the ones who planted boa constrictors, baked cakes, and served coffee with a past that no one dared to touch. And the woman, oh, the woman, discovered this in the worst possible way. By Friday night, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had ceased to be one of uncomfortable silence. Now it was really tense. The kind you could cut with a knife. Nobody barbecued anymore. Nobody washed their car on the sidewalk. And the few who still ventured out did so looking around, as if they had committed a crime. The cars were still there, lined up like soldiers in attack positions. And the men? Steady. They didn't talk. They didn't laugh. They didn't use their cell phones. They were just there. They were there with such presence that even the wind seemed to respect their space. It was as if each step those guys took was an unspoken sentence, a story that no one wanted to hear live. The woman, the one who thought she was the president of everything, was no longer sleeping properly. The lights in her house were now on all night. The alarm? It went off twice for no reason. They say she tested it herself, but you can't buy security with a button. You don't get respect by printing out an HOA card. At the weekend, reinforcements arrived. More cars, people from outside. A black model shining in the sun parked right on the corner. Out of the back seat came a guy who wasn't big, but had a presence that made even the asphalt seem stiffer. Dark suit, glasses, close-cut hair. He didn't need to look at anyone. When he leaned against the wall of the square, the others automatically made way. The air became denser. What about the neighborhood? He held his breath. The woman freaked out. She called the police. There's a group holding a vigil outside my house. They're threatening me. It's a gang. The car arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers, tired, looking like they'd had their lunch break. They got out of the car, looked around, and froze. One of the officers recognized someone, and it wasn't my mother. The conversation was short. One of the men in the cars said something in the policeman's ear, and he simply nodded. The other officer turned to the woman and said, in the voice of someone who didn't want to be there, "Ma'am, they're not doing anything illegal. They're just standing around." She almost fell over hard. She screamed, said that the neighborhood was a family place, that this was unacceptable, that she paid taxes. But the policeman shrugged and uttered one of the most satisfying sentences I've ever heard. "If you want private security, we'll recommend a company, but there's nothing we can do." The car drove away. The woman stood there on the sidewalk, shaking with anger, fear, or both. And the men? They didn't even blink. They remained as they were, unyielding. That same day, someone, we still don't know who, put a sign on the door of her house. A simple piece of paper, written by hand, stuck on with masking tape. It said just that. Respect is asked for before you have to beg. That was enough for her to disappear again, this time for 3 days. The garbage wasn't collected. The gate was locked. No one saw a shadow of the creature, and the neighborhood began to breathe a little less fearfully, but with many more stories to tell. The neighbors began to move around slowly, like someone coming out of mourning. There was an elderly man who left a bottle of soda on the hood of one of the cars. A child rode by on a bicycle and waved. A dog even slept next to the tire of one of the cars. It was as if the street was being renamed, not with signs, but with attitudes. My mother continued to make coffee. A new thermos appeared on the balcony, and every time someone took a cup and thanked her with a nod, she smiled with that discreet way of someone who has lived a long time and knows that some battles are won with silence, patience, and a good recipe for cornmeal cake. What began as revenge was now protection. The neighborhood understood. Perhaps she didn't yet, but time would take care of that. When the woman reappeared, she looked like a different human being. Her neat hair was no longer impeccable. Her clothes seemed to have lost the shine of her self-confidence, and that plastic smile, which she used to hand out with gusto just to feign superiority, now trembled at the corner of her mouth as if she had forgotten how it was formed. She tried to walk down the street as if nothing had happened. She passed in front of the cars, looked away, and pretended that the eyes of the street weren't on her. But they were, and not only were they were savoring it. Because there's nothing more satisfying than seeing arrogance come face to face with its own consequences. And of course, she wasn't going to accept that quietly. It would be too much to ask. She had the audacity to call an emergency HOA meeting. She sent out emails, pamphleted mailboxes with paper printed in Arial 12 font, and a bold title, Urgent, Meeting on Safety and Antisocial Behavior in the Neighborhood. Who showed up? 4 people. 2 elderly people who didn't understand the context, a lady who just wanted to complain about the pigeons, and a young man who went for the gossip. She tried to make a speech. She struck a pose, climbed up on a makeshift garden stool, and began, "We are living through a critical moment where our neighborhood is being taken over by threatening behavior. We need to restore order." The young man coughed loudly. One of the old men yawned. The pigeon lady said she preferred it when the street kids were around because at least no one kicked the animals. She got down from the stool with her dignity on the ground and went home as quickly as a mouse runs when the light comes on. But the fatal blow was yet to come. An envelope was left on her doorstep. No sender, no logo, just her name in capital letters. Inside, a notice from the condominium manager informing her that, after dozens of complaints registered by residents and under investigation for misconduct as an HOA representative, she was being officially removed from her position, and her stay at the property was under review. That's exactly what you read. In addition to losing the power she never deserved, she was also going to have to explain how she bought that house, since, according to the records, she had omitted debts and declared incompatible income in order to get the financing approved. One of the neighbors, a realtor, dug up all the paperwork. The trouble left the street and went straight to the legal sphere. Over the next few days, it went downhill. Civilian vehicles began to appear discreetly, documents were collected, emails were analyzed, and, on a gray Saturday, she was officially notified that she had 15 days to vacate the residence. What did she do? She tried to appeal. With that dramatic tone of someone who has always lived in a world where she is the star of her own show. She went from house to house, knocking on doors, trying to convince her neighbors that she was being persecuted. No one answered. Those who did feigned dementia. One neighbor even said, "Gee, I thought it was the rain cookie girl." It wasn't. It was the woman who called a mother useless in front of an entire community. And now she was there, begging for empathy from those she treated like dirt. On the last day, when the moving truck arrived, it was as if the neighborhood breathed in unison. The curtains opened, the gates creaked, and a chair or two appeared on the sidewalk. It looked like a parade, but the other way around. While the furniture was being brought out, one of the gentlemen, the same one who had taken off his hat to my mother, appeared with a portable radio. He turned it up to the last volume. It was playing Respect by Aretha Franklin. Coincidence? No one there believed in coincidences. She left with her face covered by sunglasses, walking quickly, without talking to anyone. She passed my mother, who was sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea. My mother didn't say anything. She just raised her head slightly, in a gesture that said it all. The street applauded. It was as simple as that. Discreet, Dry, genuine applause. From those who understood that the cycle was closed, that disrespect was paid for with the right price, and that, at the end of the day, it's not about shouting louder. It's about knowing who you are and having a network of people who know you inside out. The woman left. The street breathed again. The cars disappeared as slowly as they had arrived. Silent, elegant, loyal. And my mother? She continued with her plants, her coffee, and her peace. Because in the end, those who have respect are never alone. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.